The vampire king's hand closed around a dying woman's wrist before 300 nobles could draw breath. "Take it off," Lucian Draven said. "Take the necklace off, now." Elena Hart didn't understand. She only knew that the most feared ruler in 7 centuries had crossed an entire ballroom to reach her, and that his eyes weren't on her face. They were on the ruby resting against her collarbone, the one her mother had begged her never to remove after dark. Lucian knew that ruby. He knew the exact weight of its setting because his own hands had fastened that clasp around his wife's throat the night before she vanished. 700 years ago, Serafina Draven had no grave, no body, no answers. Only a necklace the entire vampire world believed had been lost with her. So how was it now trembling against the throat of a human widow who had never set foot in this kingdom before tonight? Comment below and tell me which kingdom you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. And if you believe some loves outlive death itself, subscribe and stay to the end, because what the king is about to kneel and say will unravel 700 years of grief. The invitation had called it the Concord of Clans, a rare gathering where every vampire house set aside old blood feuds for one gilded night. Elena Hart had no idea what any of that meant. She only knew Noah had begged to see the pretty castle from the flyer someone had slipped under her apartment door, and that turning down a free night out felt like one small mercy she could give her son after the year they'd had. She should have known something was wrong the moment they let her in without a single question. Inside, the hall swallowed her whole, gold pillars climbing into shadow, chandeliers dripping candlelight over faces too still, too pale, too perfectly composed to be ordinary guests. Noah's hand was a small, hot weight inside hers. She gripped it like an anchor. She wasn't listening to any of the murmured introductions around her. She was watching the room the way she'd learned to watch every room since her husband died, for the nearest exit for anyone looking at Noah too long, for anything that might go wrong before she could get them both safely home. That was the moment the king saw her. Across the hall, King Lucian Draven had spent the last 700 years perfecting the art of feeling nothing in public. He had buried 3 centuries of political marriages, a dozen assassination plots, and every rival who'd whispered that a king without a queen was a king without an heir. None of it had touched him. He had made sure of that. Then his gaze crossed the crowd and stopped on a ruby at a stranger's throat, and 700 years of careful nothing came apart in half a second. He knew that ruby. He knew the hairline scratch beneath the 3rd facet, because Serafina had caught it on a doorframe on their wedding night and laughed instead of caring. He knew the setting had a crest hidden beneath it that only a king and his queen had ever been told existed. He knew, because he had never once stopped searching for it, that this necklace had vanished from the world on the same night his wife had. Lord Malric's voice reached him from somewhere far away, urgent, warning him to stop. Lucian didn't hear a word of it. He was already walking, and the court was already parting in front of him the way rooms part in front of men who have stopped pretending to be reasonable. Elena saw him coming and felt every instinct in her body scream run. But there was nowhere to run, and Noah was still holding her hand and whatever was about to happen. She wasn't leaving him behind to face it alone. Lucian stopped in front of her, and the king who had not wept in 700 years felt his eyes fill without his permission. "My queen," he whispered. Then he sank to his knees before a terrified human widow, and the entire vampire court forgot how to breathe. The silence broke like glass. "Seal the doors," Lucian said, rising. His voice carried no tremor now. Grief had folded itself back beneath the crown. "No one leaves this hall." Kale and Darius moved before the echo finished. Great iron doors groaned shut at both ends of the chamber, and 300 nobles who had come dressed for celebration suddenly understood they had walked into something else entirely. Elena's hand tightened around Noah's shoulder, pulling him close. "What is happening? Why are you locking us in?" Lucian didn't answer her. He was still staring at the necklace as though it might vanish again if he looked away. Lord Malric reached him first, robe sweeping across marble. His voice pitched low and urgent. My king, think. A human appears wearing the queen's necklace on the one night every noble house is gathered under this roof. This is not fate. This is a weapon or a forgery or a trap laid by someone who understands exactly what that jewel would do to you. I am aware of what it is doing to me, Malric. Then let me take her to the lower halls. Question her properly. If she is innocent, no harm comes to her. If she is not, no one touches her. The words came quiet, but they moved through the hall like a blade drawn from its sheath. Kael's hand had already drifted to the hilt at his side, positioning himself half a step in front of Elena without being asked. Darius mirrored him on the other side, and for the first time since the glass had shattered, Elena felt something other than terror. The strange, dizzying sensation of being protected by men who an hour ago would have looked at her as nothing more than prey. Malik's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. He only watched. I don't know who Serafina is, Elena said. Her voice shook, but she made herself hold Lucian's eyes. I don't know what any of this is. This necklace belonged to my mother. She gave it to me before she died and told me never to sell it. Never to take it off after dark. That's all I know. That's all I've ever known. Then you will not object, Lucian said, to proving it. He stepped closer. Kael tensed, hand tightening on his blade, but Lucian raised 2 fingers and the guard went still, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. Lucian reached out and lifted the ruby pendant from where it rested against her collarbone. Elena flinched, but did not move. Noah pressed himself into her side, eyes wide, watching the king's face rather than the jewel. Lucian turned the ruby over in his palm. The court held its breath. Even Malric went silent, leaning forward despite himself. Beneath the golden setting, worked into metal so old it had darkened nearly to black, was a crest. 2 crescents crossed beneath a crown, so small and so cleverly hidden that a human jeweler could examine the piece for 100 years and never find it. Only a king would know to look. Only a king who had once pressed his lips to that exact spot on that exact night would know it was there at all. Lucian's hand began to shake. Only Serafina and I knew this existed, he said, and the words came out broken in a way that made every noble in the hall lean back, as if his grief were a fire too close to stand near. I had it made myself. I gave it to the royal smith with my own hands and told no one. Not my council, not my guard, not even Malric. There is no forgery of this. There is no copy. There is only the necklace I gave my wife on our wedding night. And there is no explanation for how it is hanging around the throat of a woman who has never set foot in this kingdom before tonight. That's not possible, Malik said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Watch, Lucian said, and tell me again what is possible. He closed his hand around a ruby. Light bled up from beneath his fingers first, a deep, pulsing crimson, like something breathing after centuries of held breath. Gasps rippled through the hall. Nobles who had not flinched at wars now stepped back from a piece of jewelry glowing in a king's closed fist. Lucian opened his hand. The ruby was no longer simply a stone. Fine lines of light had risen to its surface. Ancient runes none of them had seen outside the oldest royal texts, tracing themselves across the gem's face like veins filling with fire. The necklace is answering, someone whispered, and the word rippled backward through the crowd. Answering, answering. It's answering, until the whole hall was a hush of disbelief. But it was not answering Lucian alone. The light did not stay contained in his palm. It spread down the chain, past his fingers, onto Elena's skin where the pendant still touched her collarbone, and she gasped as warmth bloomed there, not painful, but deep, like something recognizing a body it had been waiting for. Beside her, Noah made a small sound and reached out with one hand, and the runes brightened at his nearness, curling toward him the way a flame leans toward air. It shouldn't do that, Malik breathed. It should only answer royal blood. It should only answer him. Lucian said nothing. He was staring at Elena and Noah with an expression none of his court had ever seen on their king's face. Not grief, not fury, but the terrible, fragile shape of a question he did not yet know how to ask. The runes pulsed once more and slowly began to dim, sinking back beneath the ruby surface like something retreating into sleep. In the silence that followed, small and clear enough for the entire frozen hall to hear, Noah tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, staring at the necklace with the calm, unbothered curiosity only a child could manage in a room full of terrified vampires. "There's a lady crying inside the stone." The words seemed to hang in the air long after Noah spoke them, and no one in the hall moved to break the silence first. Lucien did. "From this moment," he said, turning to face the court, "the human woman Elena Hart and her son Noah stand under the protection of the vampire crown. Any hand raised against them is raised against me." The hall erupted. "My king, she is a human? This is madness. She could be anyone." "A spy," someone shouted from the back, a noblewoman in deep emerald silk, her voice cutting sharp through the din. "Sent by the eastern courts to unravel you with a trinket and a sad story. Wake up, my lord, before she destroys everything your line has built." The accusation caught like fire through dry grass. Voices rose on every side. "Spy, weapon, trap, kill her before she weakens him." Until the golden hall rang with a fury that had nothing to do with celebration anymore. Elena felt Noah press harder into her side and hated, more than she had hated anything in years, that her son had to hear people discussing her murder in polite, cultured voices. Enough. Lucien didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The single word moved through the hall and silenced it as thoroughly as a blade through a throat. "The next noble who speaks of harming this woman will answer to me personally. I do not care whose house you carry." No one spoke again. "Kale, Darius, take them to the west wing. Guard the door yourselves. No one else touches it." He looked at Elena, and for just a moment the king fell away and something almost gentle remained. "You are safe. I swear it on my crown." Elena didn't believe him. Not yet. But she let Kale guide her and Noah from the hall anyway because staying meant standing in a room full of people openly discussing whether she deserved to live. The palace corridors were worse than the hall in their own way. Quieter but not empty. Shadows moved along the edges of every archway they passed, robed figures who fell silent as they approached and did not resume speaking until well after they'd gone. Elena caught fragments anyway. Should have been killed on sight. If she weakens him further, someone will have to. The boy too, if it comes to it. Kale's jaw tightened with every whisper, but he said nothing until they reached a heavy door at the end of the west corridor and ushered them through it. "Ignore them," he said, low enough that only she would hear. "Fear makes vampires say ugly things. It does not mean they will act on it, not while the king's protection stands. And if his protection doesn't stand forever?" Kale had no answer for that. He simply bowed his head and took up position outside the door, Darius mirroring him on the other side, and left her alone with her son in the chamber more beautiful than anywhere she had ever set foot in her life, and twice as frightening for it. She had barely gotten Noah settled by the fire when the door opened again. Lucien. He entered alone, and, for the first time since the ballroom, he looked less like a king and more like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally set it down somewhere he could look at it directly. "I want answers," Elena said before he could speak. "Real ones. Who is Serafina? Why does a dead woman's face keep flickering behind your eyes every time you look at me? Why is my son being threatened by people I've never met over a necklace my mother gave me?" Lucien was quiet for a long moment, as if deciding how much of 700 years a person could survive hearing all at once. "Serafina was my wife," he said finally. "My queen. The only woman I have loved in over 2,000 years of living. And I have loved no one since." He said it plainly, without performance, the way men speak of facts too old to still hurt out loud, except it clearly still did. 700 years ago, she vanished. No body, no warning, no explanation. Only that necklace disappeared with her, and it has not been seen again until tonight, on your throat, in my court. Elena sat down slowly across from him, the weight of it settling into her chest. You think I have something to do with her disappearing? I think, Lucien said carefully, that you are wearing something that should not exist outside a locked vault. I have guarded myself for 7 centuries. I do not yet know what that means. I only know it means something, and until I understand it, you and your son are the safest people in this kingdom and the most hunted, both at once. Elena pressed a hand to her mouth. Her mother's warnings, never sell it, never remove it after dark, no longer sounded like superstition. They sounded like the last instructions of someone who had known exactly what danger that ruby carried and had never told her daughter why. My mother knew, she whispered. She knew this would happen. She just never told me. Lucien said nothing. There was nothing yet to say. He found Malric waiting outside the chamber when he left, arms folded, expression carved from stone. This is not wisdom, my king. This is grief wearing a crown. Careful, Malric. 700 years I have watched you refuse every alliance, every marriage, every chance to move forward, all in her name. And now you would throw the stability of this court into chaos over a human woman and a trinket, because some small, desperate part of you wants so badly for it to be true. Lucien turned, and there was nothing gentle left in his face at all. My grief has ruled me for 700 years, he said. Do not mistake it for weakness. Malric said nothing more. He only bowed and withdrew into the dark of the corridor. He did not see the figure already stationed in the shadows across from Elena's chamber door, still, patient, eyes fixed unblinking on the gap beneath it, waiting for the palace to sleep. Sleep didn't come easily in a palace built of shadows and gold. But Elena hadn't expected it to come at all. She lay awake beside Noah's small, steady breathing, turning her mother's words over and over until they wore smooth as river stones. Never sell it, never take it off after dark. She had thought it was grief talking in those final months, an old woman's superstition tangled up with sentiment. Now she understood her mother had been afraid, genuinely, specifically afraid of something she had never once explained. The door opened at first light. Lucien again, though this time Cale stood a step behind him, already dressed for travel. You're home, Lucien said without preamble. You said your mother left you the necklace. Are there other belongings of hers? Letters, boxes, anything she kept hidden? Elena sat up slowly. There's an old trunk in my closet. I never went through all of it. It felt wrong somehow, picking through everything after she died. I told myself I'd do it eventually. She hesitated. Why? Because your mother knew something, Lucien said. And I intend to find out what. He sent Cale within the hour. The guard returned before midday carrying a battered wooden trunk under one arm as though it weighed nothing, which, to a vampire, it likely didn't. He set it at Elena's feet with unusual gentleness, as if he understood what it meant to hand a woman the last unopened pieces of her mother's life. Elena knelt before it, with hands that wouldn't quite stay steady. Noah crouched beside her, curious and solemn, watching her lift out folded blankets, a chipped teacup, photographs gone soft at the edges. Near the bottom, wrapped in a scrap of faded velvet, was a small wooden box she didn't recognize. Inside it, a journal, its leather cover cracked with age, the handwriting within unmistakably her mother's. Elena's breath caught. She read in silence for a long moment before her voice finally broke through. She writes about a woman, white hair, wounded. She says wounded, hunted. She showed up at the back door one night in the rain, half collapsed, begging to be let in before someone found her. Elena looked up, and her hands had started to tremble along with her voice. My mother says the woman pressed this exact necklace into her hands and told her to protect it, to never let it go. to keep it safe until she swallowed, until it found its king again. Lucian had gone very still. "Describe her," he said. "Everything your mother wrote. Every detail." Elena read on. Quieter now, hair white as frost, though she wasn't old. "My mother was certain of that," said. Her face looked young beneath the exhaustion. Eyes the color of storm water. A voice that broke on every other word, like she'd been crying for years and had nothing left to cry with. She looked up. "My mother wrote that the woman kept saying one thing, over and over, before she vanished into the dark. Protect it until he comes. He will know it. He will know me." Lucian's hand had risen unconsciously to press against his chest, as though something inside it had cracked open all over again. "That is her," he said, and his voice had lost every trace of the king's iron in it. "That is Seraphina. I would know that description if you gave it to me in 1,000 years, in 1,000 tongues. It is her." "It can't be," Malik said from the doorway. None of them had heard him arrive. He stepped into the room, gaze flicking between the journal and his king with open alarm. "My lord, think. If this account is true, it would mean Seraphina did not simply vanish 700 years ago and die shortly after. It would mean she survived for centuries, appearing to a human stranger only decades past, and never once sending word to you. That is not devotion, my king. That is either impossible, or it is a lie someone wants you to believe. You think this woman forged an entire journal," Lucian said, "written in a hand that has aged exactly as long as it claims to have buried inside a box no one but Elena's family has touched in decades. All to deceive a king who did not even know Elena existed until last night?" Malric's jaw tightened. "I think grief makes fools of even the wisest men. I have watched it make one of you for 7 centuries. And I think," Lucian said, low and final, "that I have spent 700 years being told my wife was dead, and I would rather chase an impossible truth than accept a comfortable lie ever again. You may doubt this, Malric. I will not." Malric said nothing further. He only bowed and withdrew, his silence heavier than any argument. Elena, still kneeling by the open trunk, looked down at the necklace resting once more against her collarbone, and gasped as warmth bloomed beneath her fingers, sudden and deep, the ruby brightening to a soft, pulsing crimson. The room dissolved. Snow, endless white, churned dark at the edges where something had dragged itself through it. A woman ran through the drifts with white hair whipping loose behind her, one hand pressed hard against her side where blood bloomed black against pale fabric, staining the snow in her wake. Her breath tore ragged from her throat. Behind her, distant shapes moved through the trees. Pursuers, patient and unhurried, the way predators move when they know their prey cannot run much farther. The woman stumbled, caught herself against a frozen tree, and pressed a trembling hand to the ruby at her throat. "Lucian," she whispered, and her voice broke on his name like something precious being deliberately shattered. "Forgive me. You must never know. Not until the child is safe. Not until—" The vision snapped shut like a closing fist. Elena came back to herself, gasping, the taste of cold air still somehow lingering in her throat, though the room around her was warm. Beside her, Lucian had sunk to one knee, both hands pressed flat against the floor as though the world had tilted beneath him, and he needed the stone to hold him upright. She was alive, he said, to no one, to everyone. 700 years, and she was alive. It took Lucian a long time to rise from the floor. When he finally did, something in his face had changed. The grief was still there, but underneath it now ran a current of something sharper, more dangerous. Purpose. "There is a chamber," he said, "sealed since before your grandmother's grandmother was born. Relics from the earliest age of our kingdom. If Seraphina truly lived, if she truly protected something worth this much blood and secrecy, the answer will be there. Or it will be nowhere. You want to take Noah into a room full of vampire artifacts," Elena said, disbelief sharpening her voice. I want to understand why my wife spent centuries in hiding rather than come home to me, Lucian said quietly. And I fear, Mrs. Hart, that the answer has something to do with your son. The relic chamber sat beneath the palace's oldest wing, behind a door Cale and Darius unsealed with a ritual that took nearly 10 minutes and left both guards faintly out of breath. Inside, the air itself felt older, heavy, charged, humming faintly the way a held breath hums before release. Stay close to me, Lucian told Elena. These artifacts have burned careless nobles down to ash. They will not forgive a human's touch. Elena gripped Noah's shoulder hard enough that he squirmed. Then he isn't touching anything. But Noah, 6 years old and utterly unbothered by 700 years of accumulated dread, had already slipped half a step ahead of her, drawn toward the room the way children are drawn toward things adults are too afraid to look at directly. The moment he crossed the threshold, the chamber changed. Every relic in the room, blades sheathed in dust, urns sealed with wax older than empires, a crown of black iron resting on a velvet cushion, began to glow, not with menace, not with the violent crimson flare that had lit the ballroom. A soft, pale gold light, gentle as candlelight, rippling outward from each object like water remembering the shape of a stone dropped in long ago. Cale made a sound low in his throat, something between disbelief and reverence. That is not possible. These relics have burned vampire nobles who dared touch them without permission. A human child should not be able to stand this close without bursting into flame. Darius finished, staring. And yet, Elena's grip on Noah's shoulder had gone white-knuckled. Noah, come back here right now. But Noah wasn't listening. He had drifted toward the far wall, where an old mirror stood propped in a frame of tarnished silver, its surface clouded with age. He reached up on his toes and pressed his small palm flat against the glass. The mirror didn't reflect him. It rippled instead, the way still water ripples when something breaks its surface from beneath. And then it showed a woman. White hair, storm-gray eyes, a face carved from the same quiet sorrow Elena had glimpsed in the snow vision only hours before. Serafina stood in what looked like the corner of a small, humble room, nothing like a palace, cradling an infant wrapped in plain white cloth against her chest. She was humming something wordless, rocking gently, her expression the particular exhausted tenderness of a mother who had given up everything to keep one small thing safe. "Mama," Noah whispered without turning around. "That's the lady from the necklace. She's not crying anymore." Elena crossed the room in 3 strides and yanked her son back from the mirror so hard he yelped. "Enough. That's enough. Get away from it." "Elena." Lucian's voice, urgent but careful, the tone of a man trying not to startle something fragile. "He isn't in danger. Look at him. He isn't afraid. I don't care if he's afraid. I care that a room full of magic is showing my son visions of a woman who's been dead for 700 years, and every relic in here is reacting to him instead of you, the actual king. And nobody will tell me why." Her voice cracked on the last word, fear and fury tangled too tightly to separate. "You said this necklace was dangerous. What if it isn't the necklace? What if it's him? What if I've handed my son over to become part of some prophecy I don't even understand?" Lucian crouched, bringing himself down to Noah's height, and for a long moment simply looked at the boy, searching, careful, the way a man looks at something he is both desperate to understand and terrified, too. "I don't know what he is," Lucian admitted quietly. "I will not lie to you, but I know this. Nothing in this room has harmed him, and I will not let anything else touch him either. That much I can promise, even if I cannot yet explain the rest." It wasn't enough, but it was something, and Elena, shaking, pulled Noah against her chest and held on. They found Malric an hour later in the palace archives, 3 chandeliers worth of candlelight burning around him, and a wall of ledgers pulled down into unsteady stacks. "My king," he said, And for the first time since the ballroom, his voice had lost its cold certainty entirely. I went looking for records of the old bloodlines, thinking to prove the boy's reaction was some trick, some coincidence. I found this instead. He held out a ledger, brittle with age, one page torn away so cleanly it could only have been deliberate. Beside the tear, faint indentations remained where a heavier hand had once pressed a seal into the parchment. A royal bloodline, Malik said. Erased. Someone went to considerable trouble to make sure no record of it survived, but they missed this. He turned the page, revealing a line of near-invisible ink beneath the tear, legible only by candlelight held at an angle. Seraphina's name. And beside it, he set the ledger down and pointed to 3 small symbols pressed into the corner of the page. Crests Lucian recognized instantly, crests that belonged to 3 of the oldest, most trusted noble houses in his own court. Lucian went very still. "Malric," he said quietly, "tell me I am wrong about what I am looking at." Malric did not answer. He didn't need to. Whoever had erased Seraphina from history, whoever had hunted her through the snow 700 years ago and forced her into hiding with a stolen child, they had not come from some rival kingdom beyond the borders. They had been standing inside the throne room the entire time. Lucian gave no outward sign that anything had changed. That was the first rule of hunting traders who had waited 7 centuries to be found. You did not let them see you looking. He moved carefully over the following days, questioning old records under the guise of court administration, sending Kale to quietly interview retainers of the 3 houses whose crests had been pressed beside Seraphina's erased name. What he learned confirmed the shape of the wound before he even had proof of the hand that made it. All 3 houses, Ashcroft, Voss, and Renfeld, had opposed Seraphina in the final years before her disappearance. Not loudly, not where it could be recorded. But Seraphina had spent her last years as queen pressing for something radical. A fragile peace between vampire and human kingdoms. Treaties that would have ended centuries of feeding, hunting, and fear as the natural order between the 2 peoples. The old houses had called it heresy dressed as mercy. They believed a queen who taught her people compassion for prey was a queen who would end vampire rule within a generation. Better, they had apparently decided for the peace-loving queen to simply disappear. Lucian read the whispered testimonies with his jaw locked so tight it ached. 700 years of grief. And the answer had been this simple, this ugly. The entire time, she had not been stolen from him. She had been erased by his own court for loving too much of the world he ruled. He was still turning the weight of it over when Darius burst into the study without knocking, blood on his sleeve and fury in his eyes. "The gardens. Elena, she's been attacked." Lucian was moving before the sentence finished. He found the scene half resolved by the time he arrived, 2 hooded figures down on the gravel path, one unmoving, one gasping and clutching a wound Kale had opened across his ribs. Elena stood pressed against a stone bench, pale and shaking but unhurt, nowhere in sight. Thank every old god still listening. She'd sent him inside with a nursemaid before walking the gardens alone. A small mercy that had likely saved his life. A third one ran, Kale said grimly, kneeling over the wounded attacker. "We couldn't hold both and protect her at once. I made the choice." "You made the right one," Lucian said, and crouched before the dying assassin instead, gripping the front of his cloak. "Who sent you?" The man's breath rattled, blood already darkening at the corner of his mouth. He looked up at Lucian with something almost like pity. "The queen," he rasped, "should have stayed buried." His eyes went glassy before Lucian could demand another word. Lucian knelt there a long moment, the dead man's cloak still fisted in his hand, understanding settling over him cold and absolute. This was not a rumor stumbled into by chance. This was a network, patient and old, that had known Seraphina survived, or at least suspected it strongly enough to act the instant her necklace resurfaced. Someone inside his own walls had given the order. Elena found him 20 minutes later in the corridor outside the guest wing, and the fear on her face had curdled into something closer to rage. "My son was almost an orphan tonight," she said, voice shaking with the effort of keeping it level. "Not because of anything I did, not because of anything he did. Because of a war that started 700 years before either of us was born, and nobody thought to warn me, I'd walked straight into the middle of it." "Elena, no, you don't get to Elena me right now." She stepped closer, and for the first time since the ballroom, there was no fear left in how she looked at him, only fury, sharp and clean. "You keep promising me protection, guards outside my door, sealed halls. And every single time, something finds a way through anyway, because protection isn't the same as the truth. And you have been feeding me half of it since the moment I walked into your court. I have told you everything I know. Then find out what you don't know," Elena snapped. "Because I did not ask for any of this. I did not ask to be a widow raising a son alone. I did not ask for a stranger's dead wife's necklace to turn my life into a battlefield, and I will not stand here and watch my son become collateral damage in a fight over a crown I never wanted any part of. I want the truth, Lucian. All of it. Or Noah and I walk out of his palace tonight and take our chances with whoever's hunting us in the human world. Because at least out there, I know what I'm afraid of." The silence that followed held real weight. The first honest silence between them since the ballroom, stripped of grief and politics both. Then Lucian did something none of his court, watching from the shadowed edges of the corridor, had ever once seen their king do twice in one lifetime. He knelt, not in grief this time, not in the shattered involuntary collapse of a man undone by memory. This was deliberate. A king lowering himself before a human woman with his spine straight and his eyes steady, the full weight of 700 years behind every word. "By my crown," he said, "by my blood, and by Seraphina's name, I will find who did this. I will find who took her from me, who has hunted her family for generations, and who dared raise a hand against your son tonight. I will not rest until it is done. And I will not lie to you again while I do it." Elena stared down at him, breathing hard, the anger in her slowly giving way to something rawer and harder to name. "Then don't," she said quietly. "Don't rest, because I need to believe you mean that." "I do," Lucian said. "I swear it." The royal scholars arrived within the hour, 3 ancient vampires so old their names had nearly worn away from common memory, robed in gray, moving with the slow deliberateness of creatures who had outlived urgency itself. Lucian had summoned them the moment Elena's fury cooled into something they could both agree on. They needed the whole truth, not fragments glimpsed through accidental visions. "The necklace holds a binding of the old kind," the eldest scholar said, turning the ruby carefully in candlelight. "Memory enchantments this deep are not meant to be triggered by touch alone. They are meant to be unlocked, deliberately, and only when the one who sealed them chooses to be seen. Then unlock it," Lucian said. "My king, whatever is bound this deeply was hidden for a reason. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. Not by you, not by this court. I have spent 700 years not seeing," Lucian said. "Unlock it." The court had gathered by then, summoned back to the same golden hall where it had all begun. Nobles and guards and the 3 ancient houses whose crests Maurik had found pressed beside a name that should never have needed hiding. Elena stood near the front with Noah's hand in hers, and Lucian noticed, distantly, that none of the assembled nobility dared stand too close to her anymore. Fear did strange things to respect. The eldest scholar pressed both palms to the ruby and spoke words in a language even Lucian only half recognized. Older than the kingdom itself. The stone answered instantly, flaring crimson, then gold, then a light with no name, spilling upward from Elena's throat until it filled the hall like water filling a bowl. And then, they were not in the hall at all. The vision opened on a war room lit by torchlight. 700 years gone. Seraphina stood at its center, younger, fiercer, her white hair unbound, listening to three noble lords speak in low, urgent voices about human villages along the northern border. "Burn them," one lord, the Ashcroft crest unmistakable on his collar, was saying. "Burn them and leave enough evidence to point toward the Voss rivals to the east. A border war buys us 3 years before the humans organize enough to threaten our feeding grounds again. 3 years is enough. You would slaughter children to manufacture a war," Seraphina said, and her voice in the vision was iron, nothing like the broken whisper Lucien had heard in the snow. "I will not permit this. You do not command us, my queen. You only marry the one who does." The scene shifted, jagged, like torn fabric. Seraphina alone in her chambers that same night, discovering ledgers, maps, the full scope of the plot lay bare in ink. Her hands shook as she read. Then, unmistakably, her palm dropped to her stomach and, understanding, rippled through the watching court like cold water. She had been carrying a child. Lucien's child. "If they know," Seraphina whispered to the empty room, "if they learn what I carry before the war is stopped, they will use the child as a weapon or kill it as a threat. I cannot let either happen. I cannot let Lucien choose between his throne and his family. They will make him choose, and it will destroy him either way." The vision tore forward through months, compressed into moments. Seraphina growing more desperate, more isolated, the 3 houses tightening their net around her as she tried and failed to warn Lucien without revealing what she carried. Then, snow. The same flight Elena had already glimpsed, but longer now, more complete. Seraphina running, bleeding, a small bundle held tight against her chest, pursuers closing from the trees. She stumbled into a small human farmhouse, gasping, and thrust the necklace and the swaddled infant into the arms of a startled young woman. Elena's ancestor, the resemblance in the jaw unmistakable even across 7 centuries. "Protect them," Seraphina begged. "The necklace and the child, both. Hide them, guard them, let no one know what either of them is. Someday a king will come looking, and when he does, you will know him. Please, I beg your bloodline, generation after generation, until the day it is safe. Protect them." The vision rippled, beginning to fray at its edges like fabric burning from the outside in. Then, for one impossible moment, Seraphina turned not toward the farmhouse woman, not toward the memory around her, but directly out of the vision itself, her storm-gray eyes finding Lucien across 700 years as though no time had passed between them at all. "Forgive me, my love," she said, and her voice cracked on every word. "I vanished so our future could live." The vision shattered into light and silence. Lucien did not kneel this time. He simply broke, standing upright, tears streaming freely down a face that had forgotten how to hide anything. 7 centuries of grief and rage and impossible, unbearable hope arriving all at once with nowhere left to go. Elena stood frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth, the pieces finally, fully assembling themselves. Her family had not simply inherited a pretty heirloom. They had guarded a queen's legacy and a hidden royal child for generation after generation, without ever once knowing why, carrying a promise none of them had been told they were keeping. "She trusted us," Elena whispered. "My family. She trusted us, and none of us ever knew." Beside her, Noah tugged at her sleeve, his small face turned upward, listening to something no one else in the hall could hear. "Mama," he said. And this time the crying voice inside the stone was clearer than it had ever been, no longer grief alone but purpose, urgent and pleading. "She says find a sanctuary. She says hurry." The words had barely left him when the ruby flared one final time. Blinding gold and light poured downward from the necklace onto the palace floor itself, burning, hissing, carving itself into the ancient stone in lines too precise to be accident. When the light faded, a map remained, scorched permanently into the marble at the center of the throne room, and every vampire in the hall stared down at it in silence. Somewhere within its lines lay the answer to 700 years of grief they left before dawn, 5 of them moving through forest paths that hadn't seen royal feet in centuries, following a map burned into marble, now folded carefully into a scrap of parchment Malric had traced by candlelight. Lucian led. Kale and Darius flanked Elena and Noah. Malric walked last, silent, his doubt worn thinner with every mile they covered without the map proving false. The ruins rose out of the earth just past midday, collapsed stone columns swallowed by moss, an entrance half buried beneath centuries of drifted soil. Easy to miss unless you already knew exactly what you were looking for. Only when Noah stepped toward the buried archway did the stone respond, groaning open along seams that hadn't moved in 700 years. She sealed it for him, Elena murmured, watching her son's small hand rest against ancient rock as though greeting an old friend. For whoever could open it, not for vampires, for him. Inside the sanctuary was smaller than Lucian had expected. A single round chamber, walls lined with shelves of records, a modest hearth, long gone cold, the quiet, worn intimacy of somewhere a person had actually lived rather than merely hidden. Dust lay undisturbed over everything except a narrow path worn into the stone floor, the kind of groove left by feet pacing the same short distance thousands of times across centuries. She was here, Lucian said, his voice unsteady. She lived here. Malric moved through the shelves with growing urgency, pulling down ledgers, unrolling brittle scrolls, his doubt visibly cracking with every page. My king, this isn't a hiding place. It's an archive. She was tracking something. The records, once assembled, told a story none of them were prepared for. Serafina had not simply vanished into obscurity after that night in the snow. She had survived for decades, then centuries, moving quietly between human settlements, always near enough to watch, never close enough to be found. And she had not protected only her own child. Over the long years, she had woven a careful, patient network. Descendants of a handful of chosen human bloodlines, each entrusted with a fragment of her legacy, each unknowingly carrying a trace of old protective magic she had woven into their lines, generation after generation. Not vampire blood, not royal blood, but something rarer, royal trust, passed down like inheritance, strong enough to let a chosen few stand near ancient relics without being consumed by them. That's why the necklace answered me, Elena said slowly, understanding arriving like cold water. Why it answers Noah. We were never royal. We were chosen. She built something into my family that lets us carry what she couldn't carry openly herself. And your son, Malric said, studying Noah with an expression caught somewhere between wonder and unease, carries it purer than any generation before him. A human child who can wake vampire relics and walk away unharmed. Do you understand what that makes him, Mrs. Hart? Valuable, Lucian said quietly before Malric could finish. And dangerous. Both, at once, the same as his mother. Elena pulled Noah closer, some of the wonder in the room curdling back into the fear she'd carried since the ballroom. Dangerous to who? To anyone who understands what he is, Lucian said, and would use him rather than protect him, which is precisely why no one beyond this room can know the full truth of what we found here. It was Malric who found the last record, tucked behind a loose stone at the base of the farthest shelf, a single, sealed page that hadn't aged the way the rest had, protected by some enchantment meant to outlast even Serafina's long exile. He broke the seal with trembling hands and read in silence for a long moment before his face went the color of old parchment itself. Malric. Lucian's voice was sharp with warning. What is it? Names, Malric said, and something in his voice had gone hollow. The conspirators. Every noble who conspired against her, who planned the border slaughter, who hunted her through the snow. She wrote every name she uncovered before she sealed this place. His hand shook so badly the page nearly slipped from his fingers. Ashcroft, Voss, Renfeld, as we already knew. And, Lucy impressed, Malric lifted his eyes, and for the first time in 700 years of unwavering, cold-blooded loyalty, Lord Malric looked utterly undone. Corvindale, he said, my own mentor, the man who trained me, who taught me everything I know of counsel and caution. He sat on the council that ordered her hunted. He has been dead 200 years, my king, but his house, his students, his legacy still moves through this court in 100 quiet ways I never once thought to question. He pressed the page against his chest as though it might steady him. I have spent 700 years serving a court built partly by the very hands that destroyed our queen, and I never saw it, I never once. The words died in his throat, because outside, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of boots on stone. Many boots, moving with the coordinated silence of trained hunters rather than the careless approach of travelers who'd stumbled onto ruins by accident. Cale was at the entrance in an instant, blade already drawn, staring out into the fading afternoon light. My king, we were followed. How many? Lucian demanded, already moving toward Elena and Noah, positioning himself between them and the door. Enough, Cale said grimly. The ancient archway groaned, stone grinding against stone as the sanctuary's old defenses stirred to life on their own, sensing danger the way they had sensed Noah's innocence. Lucian barely had time to shout for Darius to fall back inside before the door slammed shut with a finality that shook dust from the shelves above them. They were sealed in, and outside, the traitors had arrived. Chapter 9. The King's Vow. The sealed doors held for exactly as long as it took the attackers to find another way in. Stone cracked along the chamber's far wall, a hidden passage none of them had noticed, forced open from outside by hands that had clearly studied these ruins before tonight. Hooded figures poured through the breach, blades already drawn, moving with the disciplined coordination of soldiers rather than the panic of desperate men. Cale met the first of them before they'd fully cleared the gap, blade singing through torchlit air. Darius fell in beside him, and the narrow chamber became a storm of steel and shadow, shelves toppling, centuries-old records scattering across stone as the fight tore through Seraphina's sanctuary. Behind me, Lucian ordered, placing himself between the breach and Elena, but Elena was already moving on instinct, pulling Noah against the farthest wall, her hand closing hard around the ruby at her throat. Please, she whispered, not entirely sure who she was speaking to. You wanted him found. You wanted the truth. Don't let it end here. The necklace answered. Crimson light exploded outward from the ruby. No longer a gentle pulse, but a wall, a shimmering dome of light that swept across the chamber and through two attacking nobles backward as though they'd struck solid stone. The light held, steady and burning, curved protectively around Elena and Noah like something ancient finally remembering its full purpose. The shield, Malik breathed, staring from where he'd taken cover behind an overturned shelf. That is the Queen's own ward. It only answers its true guardian. He looked at Elena with something close to awe cutting through 700 years of composure. You are not simply carrying her necklace, Mrs. Hart. You are its heir. There was no time to marvel further. A tall figure stepped through the breach behind the last of the attacking soldiers. Unhood, unhurried, his face calm in the particular way of a man who believed he had already won. Lucian recognized him instantly. Lord Ashcroft, eldest of the three houses, the last living conspirator from that torchlit war room 700 years buried. You've grown old carrying this grudge, Lucian said, stepping toward him. Every trace of grief burned away and replaced with something colder. I've grown patient, Ashcroft corrected. 700 years, and you never once suspected your own counsel. Do you know how disciplined that takes? You didn't want her dead, Lucian said slowly, the last piece finally settling into place. That's why there was never a body, never proof. You wanted her gone, vanished, unexplained, a wound that would never close. A king in mourning is a king who stops asking questions. A king isolated by grief for 7 centuries is a king who can be managed. Ashcroft's silence was confirmation enough. You made me cruel, Lucian said, and his voice had dropped to something almost gentle, almost worse than rage. Cold, alone. You built me into exactly the kind of king who would never notice his own court rotting from within, and you called it strategy. It worked for 700 years. It ends tonight. Lucian moved faster than the eye could follow. Ashcroft barely raised his blade before Lucian's hand closed around his throat, lifting him from the ground with a strength born of 7 centuries of buried fury finally given permission to surface. There were no more words. There didn't need to be. When it was finished, the chamber had gone entirely silent. The last of the attacking soldiers either fled or fallen, and Cale stood breathing hard over the wreckage of Seraphina's scattered records with Darius beside him, both bloodied but standing. Elena lowered her hand from the necklace. The crimson shield faded slowly like a held breath, finally released. They returned to court 3 days later, and Malaric did not wait for permission before laying the sealed records before the assembled nobility. Every name, every conspiracy, every carefully buried truth of the war room and the border plot and the hunt through the snow. The great hall, once filled with whispered accusations against a human widow, fell into a silence heavier than any Lucian had ever commanded by force alone. They learned that their queen had not abandoned them. She had sacrificed 700 years of her own life, her own name, her own place beside her king, to prevent a war built on slaughtered villages and manufactured lies. They learned that a quiet human bloodline had guarded her legacy faithfully across generations, asking for nothing, understanding nothing, simply keeping a promise none of them had ever been told they were bound to. Lucian stood before his full court with Elena and Noah beside him, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the Golden Hall. "This woman is not my queen returned," he said. "I will not dishonor Seraphina by pretending otherwise, and I will not burden Elena Hart with a name that was never hers to carry. But for 700 years, her family kept a promise to a woman they never met at a cost they never understood, and asked for nothing in return." He turned to Elena, and something steady and certain had settled into his face. "She is the guardian of my queen's last light, and this kingdom owes her a debt it can never fully repay." No noble in the hall dared object. That evening, Lucian stood alone before Seraphina's portrait in the palace's private gallery, the ruby necklace resting once more in his open palm, Elena and Noah standing quietly beside him. He looked up at the painted eyes that had watched over this hall for 700 years of grief, and for the first time, he did not feel the familiar ache of mourning, something lost. "You are somewhere," he said softly. "I know it now, and I will not stop until I find you." He closed his hand gently around the necklace, and beside him, Elena rested a steadying hand on Noah's shoulder. The 3 of them standing together beneath the portrait of a queen who had given up everything to buy them this moment. For the first time in 700 years, the vampire king did not mourn the past, he hunted the truth.